Do you ever walk by a flyer, see some clip art on it, and ask yourself, where did that even come from? What about when you see an ad online and it uses the exact same image? Sure, it's just some cheap stock art someone pulled from a Google search, but do you ever really consider who made this? With the rise of generative AI, clip art has, unfortunately, been a steady decline both in usage and as a general business. But there was a time, a long time, that it reigned supreme across nearly every print and digital medium. And the history is pretty rich, and the stuff that came out of it really did make its dent. Clip art dates back to the Victorian ages, but it wasn't called clip art yet, they were called printer's cuts. Printer's cuts were a way for any periodical to cut out having to pay a freelance illustrator or having one on their payroll. Instead, they could pay a studio for a set of metal cuts with a variety of faces, objects, foods, symbols, anything that could fit anything. Hardly anyone, except the studio, who often just contracted out freelance artists, knew who really drew what. But immediately, publishers weren't just using them in their newspapers. People with enough money were going out and using them on their own party invitations. The business was steady and continued to thrive. It was one of the higher paying jobs as an independent artist, and the art that came from it would change with the times. Artists weren't really known for printer's cuts until the 1920s, when Cobb Shin, a prolific postcard artist, opened his own studio. Ironically, the majority of the cuts that came out of Shin's studio weren't drawn by Shin, but more contracted artists. These included Harvey Peake, Harvey Fuller, Best Livings, among many others. In 1930, Shin's studio would expand to also providing stock photography, an industry that was still in its infancy, just started 10 years prior by a photographer by the name of Armstrong Roberts. An artist making printer's cuts and selling them on their own wouldn't happen until 1933, when Reno artist Lou Heimers opened his own studio. Heimers' work was unique, humorous, and screamed the 1930s. He literally drew hundreds of little people in various situations doing various things. In 1940, Iowa artist Howard Stivers would start his own studio. Of course, due to the anonymity, it's not possible to tell which stock cuts were Stivers and which ones came from other artists, but the work that came out of Stivers' studio was a bit more generic, formulaic of the period it came from, and defined how the 40s would look in the future. Studios were coming and going. The East Texas Engraving Company, Huck & Smith, Woodruff's Engraving and Novelty House, Idea Art, and many others that have been forgotten. But in 1948, Philadelphia-born sign painter Harry Volk Jr. opened his own advertising agency.
My dad, of course, when he was forced to leave college for financial reasons, he got a job as a sign painter. He would be on a ladder doing incredible lettering on the side of a building, and that's really how his art career began. And then he went to work for Abner Galula, who had an advertising agency in Atlantic City, and he handled some big accounts when he started his own advertising agency. He left Galula, and he started his own little agency in Atlantic City. So the advertising agency did pretty well, but he was very ambitious. He had other ideas. He was always coming up with something new. And he came up with this idea of National Brands Clip Service. This was the godmother of the clip art. In those days, to do an ad, you had to have what was called a mat. It was just like a rubber stamp. All the lines that were in this were extruded from the material. And so stores needed drawings, like if you had an appliance store, you needed a drawing of a GE range. And you needed all these, things that were available to put together your ad. Now, all the major appliance people photographed all their stuff, and they had mats available for the stores to use for advertising. So he made a deal with all these companies to put together a massive mat service where stores that handled appliances would come to him for all the mats that they needed for their ads. So it was National Brands Mat Service, run by Harry Volk. He moved out of Atlantic City and he gave up all his accounts and got out of the advertising business. And he bought It was actually a house. And he gutted it, and bought a printing press.
In 1952, the Harry Volk Jr. advertising agency became the Harry Volk Jr. Art Studio.
Now, mats were starting to die off. And he said, you could probably do this with art. And they're starting to now shoot pages, photograph them. And you don't need mats. You just need to photograph the page. So little advertising agencies or stores that are doing ads in tiny podunk towns don't have access, and they can't afford to hire an artist to draw a guy pointing at something, or a car, or a policeman, or something like that. And he's got the idea, who's going to draw this stuff? He thought, I bet I can get a hold of somebody that does comic strips and see if they can recommend some people for me.
Starting in 1953, they began producing clip books, little booklets of illustrations, 2 a month that fit a variety of themes.
I started out in comic books like most of us back then. My original ambition in going to New York was to become the next Milton Caniff. I wanted to do a comic strip. So I was always sort of focused on that aspect of the business, and we saw that it was a terrible, low-end job, paid, ridiculous prices. $30 a page for penciling and inking a strip. Commercial art paid from 10 to 100 times what the comic books paid. The problem was you had to be able to draw pretty girls and handsome guys. This was the early on in the superheroes era, and they were regarded with some derision by the comic book artists. We referred to them as underwear characters. And so when I showed my samples to Stan Lee, he said, "Yeah, I'll put you right to work." And I said, "Well, that's great, Stan. There's just one thing. I don't want to do your underwear characters. I want to do your romance books so I can learn how to draw pretty girls and handsome guys and get out of this fucking business and into something that pays." He laughed and put me right to work doing his romance books. So that got me started. One of the markets was Harry Volk. I don't know who put me on to him, but I contacted him and sent him some of my stuff, and he right away put me to work. He made me a regular, contributor. I did 8 or 10 drawings a month for him. And gradually I became bored with the idea of doing a comic strip ever, because I had become friends with several of the top guys in the business. They were making $250,000 to $400,000 a year. And they were all damaged goods. They all had drinking problems, woman problems, whatever. Largely because they were so fucking bored doing the same thing over and over and over, as you can imagine a daily comic strip was. I shared a studio with a guy named Leonard Starr, who was my mentor, if you will. He did a strip called Mary Perkins on Stage, and his wife was quite beautiful, and I used her for a model until I met my wife, and who still is gorgeous, and I posed her, and I posed for the males in the photographs. So that was inexpensive. I no longer had to submit pencil sketches of what my artwork was going to be like, the finished art. He just told me, okay, do 4 or 5 family groups, and I just sent him the finished artwork, and that was it. I didn't even have to run it past him.
Volk would hire a variety of comic artists, the majority of which, unsurprisingly, have never been identified.
And one artist would recommend another starving artist, because they all had a different technique. They drew differently, and they didn't compete. they would recommend somebody that they knew that did the same stuff, and they would be part of his cadre of artists. And these people were all over the United States, and most of them he never met physically. They were only telephone people that were given assignments, and they were all starving artists because all artists in those days never had a full-time job. He was training me to take over the business because he saw that I could draw, because I used to do cartoon children for the books for him. And he figured that this thing is going to be really big and he's going to need help. And why hire somebody when you can get help from your family? Slave labor. And it just grew and grew and grew.
It got used in the most incredible places. I mean, I'd see them on billboards by the highway. It was really remarkable. They were used all over the place, used as little magnets that went on refrigerator doors, the old notes and stuff, just everywhere.
Commercial art was a huge industry and the highest paying out of any job in the arts. Many small ads were published in places like Popular Science for up-and-coming artists to learn the arts, and more specifically, how to make a profit from it. Cheap books, staple-bound and typed up with a typewriter, could be ordered and teach you the basics. Commercial art paid more than comics and sign painting, and it was an industry more open to women. But while it paid well, it was still a job without a spotlight. The commercial art of the mid-20th century, that includes clip art, heavily influenced how we see the past. Education and children's entertainment was defined by artists like Cynthia Amrine and Bernice Myers, Jill Fox's Winking Chef defined pizza, and Daniel Fox's Monopoly Man helped illustrate how we not only see the 30s, but board games and even the upper class. Fox himself remained nameless for decades until his children came forward in 2013. Considerably, one of the most famous artists in the United States, helping inspire Brian Mintz's Volt Boy from Fallout, and nobody knew his name for nearly 80 years. Volk continued to publish clipbook after clipbook, art file after art file, but by the 1980s their popularity began to wane. In 1990, Volk passed away of lung cancer. In 1993, the studio was sold to Dynamic Graphics, who tried to do something with it, failed, and in 1996, Volk was shut down completely. Dynamic Graphics, another large clip art company, had been competing with Volk for those last 30 or so years. It's safe to say that by the 80s, their stock art was likely a bit more impactful than Volk's, mainly due to an artist by the name of Frank Fruzyna, whose work adorned a plethora of fashion and department store ads throughout the 80s and 90s.
Before I was an illustrator, I was doing portraits of famous people, and that was a result of working in a few beauty salons downtown Chicago. And I was designing logos and doing drawings of beautiful women for plastic surgery offices. When they would ask me how much I want for something, I would think the biggest figure I would dare to say, and I would say it, and I would get it. I got a job at H&R Studio, and I started out drawing hammers, air conditioners, screwdrivers, bottles of shampoo, screen doors, all kinds of things for lumber companies and shoe companies. Shoes, diamond rings, because they didn't take photographs of anything back then. It was all illustration. And then one day, our salesman came in and said, there's an illustrator that's going to retire at Dynamic Graphics, and he explained to me, all of us, there was a realist illustrator who was retiring, and they needed a replacement because he was their most popular. And our whole studio tried to copy whatever he did, and I got the job. In that time, back in that day, the studio took 50% of what you made, and they gave you the other 50%. And I worked on this dynamic graphics thing for about a half a year, and I got tired of wearing myself out and getting half the money. The studio got the other half of the money just for mailing it. So I called Dynamic Graphics and I asked them, if I moved out of the studio and worked on my own, would you still buy my art? And they said, if you moved to Berlin, Germany, we'd still buy your art. You're the only reason we're working with H&R Studios. I'm like, oh, cool. So I quit, and I just started working on my own. But quitting, I would buy every magazine on the stand, all of them, whether it was Sports Illustrated or London Vogue. I would buy them all, and that's what I used as reference. When the salesman brought dynamic graphics into H&R Studio, the salesman told all of us that the top illustrator at Dynamic Graphics earns $500 a drawing. And about a year and a half down the line that I was working for Dynamic Graphics, my art director there said, you know, Frank, we got to tell you, you're number one artist in our company. And 60% of the buyers of Dynamic Graphics buy it to get your art. And I'm like, oh. And at the time I was making $250 an illustration. So a month later, I called them and said, you know what? If I'm number one, I want $500 an illustration. And they said, what makes you think you can get $500 in illustration simply by making a phone call? And I said, well, I can do that because a year ago, your company told my company that the top illustrator is earning $500 a drawing. And you just told me I'm the top illustrator. So that's what I want. And he said, well, where are you going to go if we don't give you the money? And I said, I have plenty of other work, which I didn't. So I will leave. And as I said that, the phone cord came out of the wall. And I freaked out because I feared that they thought I was hanging up on them. As soon as I plugged the phone in, and they said, we'll give you the $500 per illustration, because they did think I hung up on them.
Frank was good at everything. So if he's drawing an Easter basket, if he was drawing beautiful women, if he was drawing, a chair, it was gorgeous. So he excelled at everything he did. But I had a more of a comic book style. I remember back then I was getting a lot of illustration work, but they always say we want the Roy Lichtenstein look, which was they wanted to look like a comic book, but I guess Roy Lichtenstein sounded more prestigious. Whatever style I have, it's just from enjoying that classic comic book or old clip art or old illustrations. So it's like nice and clean and streamlined.
I was in Cancun one day, and rounding the corner on a tourist bus in Cancun was this gigantic billboard with one of my glamorous women on it. I was like, oh my God, it's really everywhere. And I saw it on Seinfeld, the John Kennedy episode, and the entrance to the gym behind the desk was blow-ups of some of my exercise illustrations.
Oh my God. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s here.
I've seen it on tickets to plays. I've seen it on bookmarks. It's been on jars. It's been on cans. It's been on bars of soap.
The fun part of doing stuff for dynamic graphics, it threw the possibility of your art being anywhere and everywhere. So you could wake up in the morning and see it in the Chicago Tribune. You could see it on a billboard. You could see it tacked to the wall of a flyer at the laundromat. It was just up and down the street. So it was always fun.
The biggest cocaine bust in 1985 Chicago, my clip art was on every single kilo. That was the best ever. One time I'm walking in the rain, I'm looking down the street, a piece of my clip art is on trash in the gutter. Oh my God, I literally am everywhere. But people started phoning Dynamic Graphics to ask who that illustrator was. And if they had told people, I would have had access to other kind of opportunities, for sure. They just told everyone who called, they told, well, her name is, I think it was Alice, and she's a senior citizen, and she likes to remain private. She doesn't want her information out. So we can't tell you. We'd love to tell you, but we can't. And that's how it went until I left. Yeah, when I found that out, I was really upset.
Enough time had passed for the old to become new, and starting in the 80s, Dover, a publisher specializing in public domain books, began to publish their own catalogs of clip art from a variety of artists, even republishing the work of Heimers and Stivers. Dover's books were very popular among designers of the 80s and 90s, and when they published books with new art, they actually credited them. Some of their most popular clip art books, however, were illustrations from the Victorian era. Many of these books filled with engravings came from the collection of Jim Harder, an artist who had amassed a very large selection of late 19th century periodicals which had become public domain. Harder used these illustrations in his own work, and made compilations for others to use through Dover Books starting in 1980. Thousands of detailed illustrations were free to use, some of which can be seen in a variety of places even now. Victorian illustrations began to be used in a satirical way dating back to the 1960s with Yellow Submarine and Monty Python's Flying Circus. Harder wasn't the only person compiling these either. A variety of books from a variety of publishers were coming out filled to the brim with random slivers of ancient engravings. Simultaneously, compilations of more contemporary art from the 30s up through the 1960s were also coming out. Starting in the early 80s, there was this explosion of old clip art taking over commercials and kitsch advertising, likely in no small thanks to the Church of the Subgenius, a pseudo-religion that had built a deity based off of only one piece of clip art they found in a phone book, a man smoking a pipe by the name of J.R. Dobbs. Tongue-in-cheek artists across the nation were in on the joke, mimicking evangelical pamphlets, comic book advertisements, and overall turning atomic consumerism on its head.
The older clip art, and that style of illustration, because it was so clean and on point, and it was done by really good artists who were top of their game, and it was like easy to go off on it because it was so, 50s or 60s smiling people holding products or kids happily jumping. So it was endlessly reworked because it was such an easy target where you just cut them up in funny shapes or, cut the head off one of the figures and stick a big eyeball on the top. It was such good artwork to collage or repurpose or parody. And I think it's always like people go back like 20 or 30 years to stuff they remember when they were little or stuff that stuck in their head. So it's always that time period of 20 years ago or 30 years ago that people always are digging back up again. You see it everywhere. You see it on, Devo album covers. You see it with the Church of the Subgenius with Bob Dobbs. You see it, on concert posters. It was everywhere, being used by the lowbrow or the punk aesthetic. Your work was already pretty much done. You just had to, re-envision it.
Eli Noyes made great use of Dover's books in his idents for MTV.
The MTV Top 20 Video Countdown.
In his segments, Art School Girls of Doom for Liquid Television. The clip art flood reached Pee-wee's Playhouse, Archie McPhee, Nickelodeon, and Nintendo. Designers had noticed the soul-deadening gaiety of clip art and were having fun with it. This trope was so popular that the Charles S. Anderson design firm built their entire business around it, publishing a series of CSA archive books, large catalogs of stock art and commercial art that they had cleaned up to resell. For a brief period, CSA even sold merchandise with these random pieces of art, some of which were drawn in-house, but the majority of which was pulled from random books and ads from decades past, some of which even coming from Heimer's and the East Texas Engraving Company. While many of these illustrations can easily be traced back to the source, the CSA archive had a ginormous copyright disclaimer that you couldn't use any of it without paying, something that they defended by saying that everything was slightly different than the original because they cleaned it up. This kind of mentality continues to exist with old clip art libraries being distributed by companies like Getty. But back to the clip art in the mainstream. The Macintosh had its own clip art by this time, dithered, pixelated, and black and white. It wasn't really until the introduction of Windows 3.1 that we got this. The type of clip art that the majority of the younger generation remembers seeing in every class presentation and playing around with it in Microsoft PowerPoint. These, too, are by anonymous artists, with only the screen beans and invention of Kathy Belleville having been identified. With the introduction of CD-ROM, you had access to cheap clip art libraries with hundreds, no, thousands of GIFs and illustrations, some of which were straight up stolen from other places, while others came from high-profile businesses. When the internet was becoming mainstream, even more clip art was being made, not just by contract artists wanting to make a buck, but by people who just wanted to share their work. Across platforms like GeoCities and Angelfire, artists were sharing their own animated GIFs and cartoon characters to be freely used. This is what helped give birth to Kathy Jarbo's Skull Trumpet. Then, when instant messaging and MySpace entered the world, smileys were unleashed as a plague. Websites sprouted up everywhere for different emoticons to use in your emails or your messages or your Facebook page. People needed a way to express their emotions besides words. And since these were private messages, you had a wide array of normal emoticons and some not so much. An entire business was built around it, perhaps made most famous by Smiley Central, a talking emoticon library with obnoxious advertisements and an extension that plagued your computer with malware.
It actually wasn't malware. Like, there was so much misconception that, we were installing these viruses. Like, we weren't. There was no malintent there. It was literally just trying to get them to search via our products. Like, we weren't putting anything on their machines other than that toolbar. The smileys are like this little surface level, ruse to get people to download that product, to download that toolbar and use the search. There was no limit to how many toolbars you could install. And I've seen, my parents, for instance, I went to their house once and I saw they had 15 toolbars installed at one time. Your computer's going to take a hit performance-wise when you have that much going on. Yeah. So literally, it was just a combination of people just over-installing various toolbars. It literally wasn't anything we were doing intentionally. We unfortunately got a bad rap, and that was why we changed our name so many times, because the reviews all were you're spyware, you're virus, but we weren't. Back in the day when I first started in 2003, that was literally my first day of work. They were just okay, let's make some smileys, and I was okay. I didn't think I was being hired for that, but luckily for me, I had a background in animation from college, so I was able to just kind of jump in and figure it out. But we initially started making them as little pixel design, so essentially opening up Image Ready, I think it was called. I used to go frame by frame, creating these pixel animations, and it was really incredible. So you'd have one of my animations were, I think, 2,000 frames. It was a pixel smiley, the one where he was at a buffet and he was just feeding himself the trays of food. So in order to make it seamless and animate perfectly, you essentially have to go through the whole motion and then make it loop back to the beginning, so you don't really notice where it starts and where it ends. We were affectionately called the Smiley Sweatshop by the CEO at the time. So I would work full time all day for them, and then I would go home and I would work all night long on creating naughty smileys. Apparently people like to search for sexual related smileys. So they paid me an additional nighttime revenue to create these naughty smileys. So I'd be up to sometimes 2-3 in the morning. It was wild times. Once we started creating those 3D looking flash ones, we never went back. We never went back to the pixel ones.
Behold the power of the smiley.
Hello! The people who worked on smileys were myself. My friend Rebecca, she worked with me at a previous job, and also my friend Scott, who worked with me at a previous job. So Rebecca Goldberg and Scott Smith, they were two big smiley people. I made, the roll on the floor laughing one who spins around and pounds his fist. Those are mine, and Rebecca makes more these big doe-eyed, I don't know, very different. And then Scott also had kind of a he made the mullet collection, I think, that mullet guy, and but yeah, we definitely all had a signature kind of look to our smileys. So within my office, we had an editorial team, and this guy Pete Grossman, he had acting roots, and he was very funny, he liked to sing, do sorts of voiceovers and stuff like that. He would go into our VP of Engineering's office and shut the door and have a whole microphone stand set up with this recording system, and he would do a lot of the voiceovers for the smileys.
Say something.
What?
Say something.
What?
Say something.
What?
Oh, I take great pride in telling you I made those ads. They broke the internet. So many people were outraged. They'd be hello.
Hello.
There was no way to shut them off. Did you ever see on YouTube the guy, we actually tried to hire this guy, but he created a whole animated video. We got in touch with him and we tried to hire him, but he declined.
Shadiness aside, it was a real product. We continued to use this clip art satirically, mostly in memes. Emojis by Yael Weiss and Tanya Kon continue to be used today, both by older and younger generations. Even now, the ruins of Shin, Heimer's, Volk, Cyber, Smiley Central, and Animation Factory linger upon the internet and even your local Trader Joe's. There's a certain beauty to that. Artwork that's meant to be anonymous and cheap not only influenced how people draw, but even how they communicate. These artists are more famous and more well-known than those who have been far more financially successful, and we don't even know most of their names. In recent times, the need for clip art has lessened. People don't include random images in their websites anymore. Advertisers, in the best cases, gone back to using their own illustrations, not stock. Otherwise, they just revert to AI instead. There's definitely room for clip art to come back, for people to have artwork to use freely at their own disposal for their own personal reasons. In the past decade, Japan has been covered in the work of Takashi Mifune, a clip art artist used by both companies and the government. And websites like Open Clip Art still exist for us to contribute to. This isn't an invitation to go out and make your own clip art, but it's an invitation to look at it the next time you see it and really appreciate it. Not like a grocery store sticker, but as a piece of art.